But just first of all, wanted to introduce everybody and acknowledge the traditional owners on the land from which I'm presenting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So I would just like to welcome everybody here. This is a Zoom webinar. We are recording, as I mentioned. So for those of us that have joined us as audience members, you are on mute and your video is switched off as default. And we will be taking questions. If you'd like to submit questions, you can submit those via the chat or via the Q&A function within Zoom, and I'll be collating those, and we will be allowing 10 to 15 minutes at the end to cover those off. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Carolyn and Fuzz Kitto. Carolyn and Fuzz are National Directors of Be Slavery Free, a coalition of civil society seeking to prevent, disrupt and abolish modern slavery. So their combined experience in undertaking community consultation, strategic planning and human rights engagement totals 75 years. And their work in recent years has been in shepherding the development of a robust Modern Slavery Act and supporting businesses with resources in their role in ending modern slavery. So Fuzz and Carolyn, I will hand over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Nimity, and it's great to work together with Fair Trade Association. Well, we'd like to start with stories because the great reformers and the great teachers throughout history have been storytellers. And when it comes to child labour, there certainly is a story to be told. In fact, there's probably 152 million stories to be told. And so one of the things which we find is really important is to really get down and to dig down into what's happening on the ground. Ubanu was from Burkina Faso in West Africa. He was a part of a family and he's the eldest of 5 children. And sadly, his father died when he was about 11, 12. His mother was left with the 5 children, a farm, and struggled to try and work out how she was going to exist and how she was going to bring up these 5 children. A neighbor, and often it is a neighbor or someone in the family, came to her and said, you know, you're going through some tough times. Oh, yes, she said, we certainly are. Said, you know, Ubanu, your eldest, I could get him a job down in Côte d'Ivoire in a cocoa farm. She said, well, but he's only 11 or 12 years old. He said, but wouldn't it be helpful to have some money to help you to survive? She said, well, it certainly would. I'll talk to him. She talked to him, and being a responsible young guy, he said, well, of course I will do that if it will help the family. So the neighbor took him to a labor agent who was actually a trafficker. Ubanu was taken into, first of all, Ghana, then across the border, which is a soft border, into Côte d'Ivoire, and was taken right across the other side by the Liberian border, out in the national forests where it is illegal to farm, but they've been cut down. In fact, in Côte d'Ivoire, 80% of the forests have been cut down in the last 40, 50 years. Most of those is for growing cocoa. They're the biggest cocoa producing nation in the world. Ubanu had no idea who he was, where he was, and he didn't know the people he was going with. And he got across and he was continually trying to work, clearing weeds, picking the cocoa pods off the trees when the 2 seasons came around to pick those. And he was told not to try and escape because the jungle had wild animals and there were guerrilla fighters out there, and that he would be maimed or killed, and he was terrified. He was given no money. Occasionally he was given a few sweets and a few treats. He had nothing but the ragged t-shirt and pants that he'd come with, and he outgrew them bit by bit as he got older. He was found when he was about 16, 17. He had no money. No money was sent back home. And the difficulty was because he always knew his village as the village or my village. He didn't even know the name of it. And it took a long, long time to get him back. When he eventually did get back to Burkina Faso, his mother, who thought he was dead, had broken down. One of his brothers had died, and he was left in a more destitute position than when he had left. Child labour is full of stories like this. And it's important for us to hear these stories because we pick up the nuances of trying to work out what is child slavery all about. So what does it mean?
So here are some definitions, and it's important that we understand these definitions so we know what we're actually talking about. So the ILO protocols, and in fact the Australian law, talks about 3 or 4 different sorts of involvement of children in work. And so the first one is called child employment or child work. And this is where children get involved in doing things that might contribute to the market, but they might be entirely informal. Child work is actually good for children. It's good for their socialisation. This is helping out around the house. It could be helping in the family business. It could be dusting shelves. It could be delivering newspapers. It could be that you have a small number of hours of paid work, and it might be in the family or it might be outside of the family. And countries have laws around the minimum age at which you are allowed to do this kind of work. And what's important about this is to understand that it is part of a positive socialising process for children. It is good for them. It is good for society. There's all sorts of skills and socialisations that they acquire, but it doesn't impact them negatively, physically, psychologically, or socially, and it doesn't impact their capacity to go to school. The next category is called child labour. So child labour is the kind of work that deprives children of their childhood, potentially deprives them of their dignity, and it becomes harmful to their development. So mentally, physically, socially, morally dangerous, and it might interfere with their school. So that interference would be because of the number of hours that they are expected to do this work. It could be because they're not getting enough sleep because of the hours that they're working. It could be the work is physically exhausting, or it's exposing them to things that are inappropriate for them to be exposed for their ages. Then hazardous labour and worst forms of child labour tend to be used a little bit interchangeably. But what gets added to hazardous labour is that it actually harms the health, safety, or morals of children. And so in this category, we find that children might be using machinery that is dangerous. They might be exposed to chemicals that are dangerous. The weight of things that they're asked to carry is very high, and it can damage their bodies. In some cases, if it's related to online sexual exploitation of children or child soldiers, it's actually going to harm their morals and their psychosocial development. It might involve them being separated from their families, being involved in having serious hazards and illness, left to fend for themselves. And at the worst end of this, there is actual slavery, prostitution, involved in illegal activities such as the trafficking of drugs, or being armed soldiers in a conflict. So we're really you're going to hear us talking about 3 categories: child employment or work, child labour, which has some negative impacts, and then hazardous or worse forms of child labour. Now, in the Australian Modern Slavery Act, worst forms of child labour are actually categorised as a form of modern slavery. So when our criminal code talks about crimes of slavery, it includes worst forms of child labour.
So why does it happen? Well, poverty is the biggest factor. 80% of children in child labour are in agricultural areas and agricultural work, and the rest are in a mixture of factories and brick kilns, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Grace Abbott was one of the great reformers in America and fought for the rights of children and of mothers and of health care, and her very astute reflection was that child labour and poverty are inevitably bound together. And if you continue to use the labour of children as the treatment for the social disease of poverty, you will have both poverty and child labour to the end of time. And it's an astute observation. We see this happening around the world in the places that we work. We've worked in 52 countries around the world. And in this area of child poverty, we see that in the places that we sometimes take people to, where we go and negotiate when we work with our on-the-ground partners. And poverty is by and far the biggest factor of why children are involved in child labour. Dr. Shanta, and we'll talk a little bit more about her story later on, from the MVF Foundation in India. She's been working there for 30 years. We had her on one of our seminars a couple of weeks back. Her observation, which we thought was so helpful, also very similar, says we often think of poverty causing child labour, but it's equally true that child labour causes poverty. If they're not able to go to school, if they in some ways have been thwarted in their capacities to learn or to be harmed in some way, either physically or mentally or ethically, then it means that their prospects of getting a good job and a good income are cut down unbelievably. So what's the extent of it?
So recently, the International Labour Organization and UNICEF released their report, which they do every 4 or 5 years, on the state of child labour in the world. And it was not encouraging. For the first time in 2 decades, the number of children in child labour had actually increased. We've been doing a fabulous job of getting those statistics to decline, and then in this last study, it increased. So worldwide, there are now 160 million children engaged in child labour, and 79 million of them are performing hazardous work. So remember, hazardous or worst forms of child labour are the kinds of labour that are going to damage these children, probably permanently. So here's pulling this out a little bit more, and we've lost the numbers off the bottom, but sorry about that. So at the beginning of this century, we were at 245.5 million children in child labour, and 5 years ago, we had dropped to 151.6, or most people would say 52 million.
152 million.
152 million, sorry. 152 million. In the last year, in the last period of this research being done, that 152 million has increased to 160 million. And there's been a lot of that increase has actually been in the worst forms of child labour. So which regions of the world is it happening in? So sub-Saharan Africa is the highest. And you'll also see that sub-Saharan Africa is contributing to the greatest increases. If you want to know more detail about these kinds of figures, Google ILO child labour, and you can find this report, and it will give you a more granular look than we're able to do in the period of time that we have. But sub-Saharan Africa is showing the greatest increase. Asia and the Pacific and Latin America and the Caribbean have been able to continue to decline in their use of child labour. Child labour is more prevalent amongst boys than girls at almost every stage of their lives. And you can see the figures that are there for 5 to 11-year-olds, for 12 to 14-year-olds, 15 to 17-year-olds. So this gives you an indication of where boys and girls are located in child labour. And I guess the really scary thing is the 10% number of 5 to 11-year-olds who are already engaged in child labour, which will indicate to you that they're, as they develop, their education and their development is likely to be curtailed.
One of the things that I have seen when I've been on the ground, I was in Peru the year before last, and looking in the cocoa area, the chocolate area particularly, with Fair Trade. And I observed and heard stories of young boys like this who are having to carry heavy rocks for building, particularly up in the mountains. There has been a major change in that area in Peru. It's just below Colombia. And there was a major problem with the drug trade, the warlords and the drug lords came down from Cambodia. Probably one of the best projects I've ever seen of USAID was the program that they instigated there from cocaine to cocoa. And so they've helped them to transition that. I talked to the farmers and said, how has this affected you and how has this affected the communities? And they said, you would not believe the fear that has gone, the self-worth that we have. But most of all, we can save our children to be able to have a healthy childhood where they're able to play, they're able to learn, they're able to be a part of their families and not have to put up with all the stresses and fear that their families were living with and working through. So often we have seen in India, children having to carry heavy bricks in the brick kilns, and those that make tiles, often the kitchen tiles, the bathroom tiles that we have in our bathrooms have come through the supply chains from India, where children are used in the production of them. It affects their health and affects their ability to be able to socialize properly and not have to be forced into the fear of doing the work or something will happen to them or to their family. One of the other areas, which is one of the saddest stories, is child labor in the conflict mineral mining in Democratic Republic of Congo. Our mobile phones and a lot of electronics need cobalt and other of these minerals to be able to function and to be built. That, of course, is one of the reasons why you'll see the great push to try and get your mobile phones, when you stop using them, to be traded in. A lot of times it's actually to get the minerals and to get the raw, or to melt down what is in there for the raw products, because it is so expensive. Why child labor in mining? Well, when you've got to go down holes like this, if you're using a child, you do not have to make the holes so big, because the child can fit into the smaller cavity that's there. The amount of children whose lives have been completely ruined and who have died because of mine collapse and because of fear, and so many of the warlords in the DRC have used children to be able to get the minerals, to be able to make the money that they need to supply the guns and to supply the power basis resources and to pay for their soldiers. Talking of soldiers.
So child soldiers, I guess this is, it's really hard to put this on a scale, but one of the first things that I did in around 2005-06, when I was working with World Vision, was went to their programs that they were running in northern Uganda, working with child soldiers. And this is where children are recruited into armed forces. It's not just as simple as giving them a gun and asking them to shoot someone. there's a whole ritualization process that goes on behind this, which often involves them killing a member of their family so that they can no longer be reintegrated back into their village. And of course, they are abused. I spent an afternoon sitting on a floor in a hut with 4 young women. They didn't really know how old they were. They were probably 15 to 17 years of age. They had each been taken as child soldiers when they were 4 or 5. And once they had become old enough, which we would not think was old enough, they had been used as sex slaves by the leaders in the Lord's Resistance Army. Each of them had 3 or 4 children. And the amazing thing about these women, we sat on the floor and they wanted to decorate their children's clothes. So I had to dredge back into my mind about how to do stem stitch and daisy chains and how to make flowers. And they taught me some of the things they knew, and I taught some of the things that I knew. We didn't have much language that we shared, but these women, their desperation was not about the pain that they'd been through, although I'm sure that was incredibly raw, but their desperation was for their children to have a different future to them. When I came home and told these stories, somebody caught up with me a few months later and said, "Oh, so have you gotten over your Uganda experience yet?" And I didn't quite know what to say. But what I did say, as gently as I could, there are some things that you never get over because they scar your soul. And meeting women as inspiring as these women and hearing stories as tragic is not a strong enough word, debilitating as the stories of their lives, is something that is not just a scar on us individually, it's a scar on humanity. So some of the products. Now, if you want to go deeper into this as well, the US Department of Labor every couple of years produces a list of all the products in the world that they have researched and found have been made with child labor. So you simply Google DOL for Department of Labor and child labor without the U because it's American. And you will get this, and you will get the full list of the products and the countries. And there's actually an app that they have there as well, which you can download. So if you're going shopping, you can actually look up on the app the product that's in what you're buying, and then you can choose perhaps to buy something else or something that is made somewhere else. So let's just do a few of these. Fuzz has already mentioned the mining type industries, the mining for coltan, but also we have gold, diamonds, and coal. Again, children are used because of their availability, but also because of their size, because it's easier to send children down a mine than it is to send adults down a mine. Soccer balls is fairly well known, and in Australia we have a couple of great options of fair trade soccer balls, and they can be purchased either through Etico or through Rep. If you are a soccer player or you have children that are playing soccer, what a tragedy if the balls that they were using were actually made by children.
Which they were for the AFL.
Yes, which they were for the AFL and the NRL a couple of years ago, probably five, six years ago. Yep. And Ben Doherty, who was then working at the Sydney Morning Herald, broke that story. And one of the fascinating little side stories that goes with this is Chris Cruther, who was the federal member that led the inquiry into Australia's Modern Slavery Act, is actually a descendant of the Sharon family, as in Sharon that makes the balls. And so for him, it was rather personal that his family's wealth in the Sharon family had actually come from a company which now engages in the forced bonded labour of children in making of soccer balls.
these are some of the other areas that child labour has been used in the production. Cotton is one of the big ones, and we'll talk a little bit more about this and some stories from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And to that now we can also add, or should also add, Xinjiang province, particularly the Uyghur, because 20% of the world's cotton comes from that area of China, where the human rights abuse of the Uyghur people has been classified as a genocide by the US government, the Canadian government, the Japanese government, EU, UK, and we're still trying to work with the Australian government to get them to take a stand, and they have been asked by those countries to work with them on this. The children are often taken away from their parents, sometimes are sent out into the cotton fields, and cotton has been riddled with it. Of the top 10 cotton growing nations in the world, Australia, because it's in the top 10, is the only country that does not have slavery, or we do not know of slavery in the production of cotton. Everywhere else it does, including the US of A. Now, garments and the fashion area has been highlighted for a long, long time. Argentina, India, Jordan, who's a big producer of garments, Vietnam, Brazil, Bangladesh, and most people know about Bangladesh if they know anything about the fashion area. But carpets is another one. And in fact, the US government has only just on this last weekend slapped a WRO, which is
a withhold and release order
on carpets from Nepal, because it's been done by children with their small hands to do the small tight knots in that. Toys is another one, and we are doing research at the moment. In fact, we only had a meeting this afternoon with our researcher who's helping us in that area, and there's much work for us to do on that. Tea is one that we've been working on for a long time, and India is one of the key areas of that. It's not so much.
In fact, we're working with the US Department of Labor to have India added to this list.
So it is not so much in the tea industry itself. It is that the pluckers, the tea pluckers, I always got to say that very carefully, are held in such poverty because of an ancient act that the British brought in to pay so little to the tea pluckers that their children, and they have a lot of children to pick the 92 kilograms generally a day that they have to pick in the plucking season to help them out, in such poverty that they are so vulnerable to labour agents who are really traffickers, who come and offer jobs and money for that to happen. Cocoa, we're going to talk about in a tick, but in West Africa in particular, just to highlight a couple. But what's the story about, again, about how children are used in this way?
Aditi's case, for example, she lived in a village in North India. When she was 14, a man showed up offering the girls jobs in a factory in the south. It sounded good. They'd be trained how to spin and weave cotton. They'd get a nice bonus. It started out like an adventure, 30 friends on a long bus trip, until they arrived. There was no training. Aditi was put to work 16 hours every day, sitting on the floor with loud machines. The factory was sweltering. The food was bad rice. Safety was non-existent. There was nothing to stop the girls from inhaling damaging fibres or even losing fingers in the machines. With no training, accidents were common. Some girls were even killed. None could bear to stay 3 years. When Aditi was too sick to keep working, she left with no money. Her injuries were not just physical. The trauma stays with her. Modern slavery appears in the worst forms of child labour, work that harms their health, physical or mental. 10 million children are trapped working in these conditions. And like all child labour, it takes away their opportunity for an education and a decent future. Aditi's case, for
So what's the dynamics of this? The sad part is that It's happening on so many levels, and therefore we need to be able to think about how we respond to it on the different levels. Adi Kapoor is one of the key consultants in the world who's been working in this area for a long, long time in human rights around Southeast Asia. In particular, she is based in Singapore, in Bangkok rather, and we catch up every time we go to Bangkok. If people can remember those times when we could travel overseas and do these wonderful things. And we would sit and continually talk through. We're running a series at the moment, and the introduction to child labour that she did with us a couple of months ago, which is available on our website, is probably one of the best introductions I've ever heard to child labour. She has articulated this well, and we've been working in this area, and we've actually known these factors, but Artie works out models and puts it so clearly. There are three areas in the dynamics of child labour. There's the contextual, there's the systemic, and there's the biographical. In the contextual, it's the big factors, factors relating to history and culture, the sociology, economics, political situation, the big things that really, really affect the vulnerabilities of children to be caught in child labour. The systemic ones are the meso, the in-between factors. It's about family and family systems, about community and services. Debts play a big one, particularly in bonded labour, where they get into debts. And we have talked with people in India who are third and fourth generations paying off the debt of their grandfather, great-grandfather, and particularly in quarries there. And the whole family, children and parents, have got to go out and to crack rocks for the industries that use them in a whole number of different areas. It's understanding the supply chains, and that's the connection in Australia we particularly have, is in the things that we buy. There is not much child labour in Australia because we've got very good laws. We've had very, very good, effective union work, and we've had good governments that have said that's not our values. The laws of a country reflect the values of a culture in a country, and that's not been a big one. But overseas, in the things that we buy, it is there. Probably something like $100 million worth of slave produce comes into Australia. And finally, the biographical ones. These are the micro, the local ones. Factors relating to personal social identity, conditioning, relationships, aspirations, and other life experiences that need to be worked on in that way. These three areas have got to be worked on with different strategies. A lot of what happens in Fair Trade Association is working with local producers, particularly in the micro areas. It's not going to affect the overall, but it will affect a family, a child, a female, a man, and it will change the life bit by bit. And that becomes an important thing to understand about what we do about it.
One of the questions that people ask us is, what is the impact of COVID? Well, this is something that was addressed in the ILO UNICEF report. And basically what they are saying is that without mitigation, that is without doing something, the number of children in child labour could rise from 160 million in the next 2 years to 169 million. And this is because as jobs become less available, children are needing to leave school for their families to simply have enough money. If the choice is school or eat, then people will make the choice to be able to eat. And we've seen that there has been an increase, as we said, over the last 4 to 5 years due to an increase in poverty. So if we want to address this issue, we need to increase social protection. And if we don't, if the poverty increases and the social protection coverage is not put in place to support these children in the time of COVID, we will see an unacceptable increase.
We don't like to jump to solutions because we think it's really important to steep ourselves in the understanding of child labour, how it happens, what are the factors, what are the dynamics around that. But one of the things that we do find is that if we're going to see change, it's really got to be a cultural change. Mahatma Gandhi said, carefully watch your thoughts for they become your words. Manage and watch your words for they become your actions. Consider and judge your actions for they become your habits. Acknowledge and watch your habits for they shall become your values. Understand and embrace your values for they become your destiny. And so it's these thinkers and these leaders, whether they be religious, whether they be community leaders, whether they be thought leaders, academics, in whatever field they work in, they're the ones that help shape the way that we see our culture. We work with companies, we work with governments, we work with NGOs and civil society, and we know that every company, organisation and government has a culture that they work within. As we were doing the lobbying for the Australian Modern Slavery Act, we met with, I think, almost over half of the politicians in the federal parliament. And we came across some really outstanding human beings across all the parties. They get in their party and it's almost like sometimes some of them actually become a different person. That's the power of culture. In the pandemic, with COVID, we're seeing all sorts of things coming out from different cultural attitudes and the way that we are tackling it. It's the same way when it comes to child labour. Nick Ingram uses this very helpful diagram where he says, well, culture, what is culture? It's the group of norms of behaviour and the underlying shared values that help keep those norms in place. Or culture is the medium in which we live, the fabric that binds us, the nutrients that feed us. Culture is so powerful. And if we're going to see any change, long-term, profound change, we've got to have a culture change that looks at these areas that ask the great why questions. Philosophers, great religious leaders, great thinkers and academics have really helped us to ask the big why question. Why is this happening? Why can't we do something about it? What's the meaning in what we do and in life? What's our purpose for being here? When we start to get into those, we start to understand that we can answer those key why questions. And Nick argues that there are 4 areas here that help shape this. We have our beliefs and values. Individually, we have our thinking, feeling, and doing. But the culture affects both of those and it interacts with it. So let's have a look at these 4 areas. Firstly, stories.
There are good stories about what is happening in communities to end modern slavery. About 8 years ago, I visited a little village called Bormakuli in the north of India near the border with Bhutan. In fact, you could get reception from the Bhutan mobile phone connection and you couldn't get it from the Indian mobile phone connection, right up there near the Himalayas. This village had been having its children disappear. It was only probably about 200 families. And what had happened is that there was a Catholic priest in this community. And the Catholic priest went into a city one day, got on a computer and an internet, and he actually found our website. And our website talked about what slavery and child labour and what unsafe migration and trafficking was. And it suddenly hit him. That is why our children are disappearing. He went back to the village, explained to them what was happening, and this village set up this amazing child protection system. I haven't got time to give you all of the details, but basically what happened was that they moved from having a couple of hundred children that they didn't know where they'd gone to only 2 children had left that village in the last 12 months. They knew where each of them were and they were safe. a village like that did it by just one person realizing what was happening. They didn't need an NGO. They didn't need intervention. They figured out how to keep their children safe, because that's what most communities want.
In the cocoa industry, there's been massive movements in the last 5 years, particularly. They took 15 years to get there. But now major companies, and Nestlé's is one of the leaders on this. It's the child labour monitoring remediation schemes there in the cocoa industry. It has dramatically changed. Still a long way to go, but it's been a good story. MVF will do what they call an area approach in India. We'll talk a little bit more about Dr. Shantu in a tick. But what they do is work across whole area, get government, get business, and get the community to work together to say, let's work on being child labour-free zones. So behaviours, very quickly.
We can change the behaviour of governments. For example, there are 3 regions or countries in the world where and that should be Xinjiang, not Xinjiang, where the harvesting of cotton is undertaken through state-sponsored labour. And so we've been campaigning. We've had the 200 ASX 200 companies in Australia who use cotton have all said that they will not knowingly use Uzbekistan cotton. We're now working on the same with Turkmenistan. And we've been working with Senator Rex Patrick and other members of the Senate who are looking to say that Australia should do something about banning what's happening with Xinjiang in relation to cotton.
When we started to work in the chocolate industry, people said, chocolate companies said, people don't care. People don't care about this. By campaigning, by raising the effect of certification, like Fair Trade chocolate, by looking at what company programs are now doing, bit by bit, we've seen a change in behaviour of the company and also of consumers saying, look, we don't want chocolate that's been produced with child labour. In the seafood industry, we did the same. A lot of young boys were sent out in the boats, many of them killed out there. 68% of people interviewed by who are ex-slaves in the seafood industry, when interviewed by United Nations, said they had seen a fellow fisher killed in the open sea. The patterns and the behaviours are changing.
And what are some of the symbols? Well, there's a lot of symbols. The Australian Modern Slavery Act is a symbol. The UN Protocol to End Child Labour has now been signed by every country in the world that is a member of the UN. That actually means that it's law everywhere, which gives us a huge capacity to move and make differences. This is the International Year of the Elimination of Child Labour. That focus allows us to do something. Fair trade schools, fair trade councils, moving to having child labour-free zones in various countries are all symbols and positive steps that are being taken.
And the final one in those 4, which we're just going to skip that one, is the leadership to champions. And these are some of the people we work with, we think are absolute champions. Derek McBain up on the top right, who's was the head of sustainability for Thai Union, which is one of the biggest seafood processing company in the world, decided that she was going to help the company to really tackle this, and she did. She is now the most awarded global sustainability manager, and we are so privileged to have her on our board. What she has done in that industry has been absolutely phenomenal in saving boys going onto fishing boats and working in slavery in prawn farms. David Cook.
David Cook was the managing director of Konica Minolta, and he made the flag of his company was, yes, we do really good photocopiers and printers, but actually we're consumed with human rights. And if you buy one of our printers, which we think are pretty good, you're also supporting a company that's involved in ending modern slavery.
Madanami Smith, that we have the privilege to partner with and know so well, based in Thailand. They've moved back to the US in this chronic period of COVID. But they were both lawyers. Matt had been working for the Kennedy Foundation, and what they have done in helping the Rohingya and helping rights throughout Southeast Asia by highlighting what's actually happening and negotiating with governments to make the change. They are making just a massive difference.
Arti Kapoor, we've mentioned, she's worked for 20 years. She doesn't look that old, but she's worked for 20 years. She is an accredited lawyer both in the US and the UK and dedicates her life to child rights and ending slavery.
Andy Hall is a good friend and lived in Thailand, worked with and helped set up the Migrant Worker Resource Network. And has actually been banned from Thailand because of his work. But he's also then, as he was kicked out, moved to Nepal and did the exposure of the rubber gloves in Malaysia. Come to Australia, has got an award by Anti-Slavery Australia, and he's an absolute leader and champion in this area.
And Dr. Shanta that we talked about, who over 30 to 35 years has worked on establishing child-free zones, particularly with children working in quarries, brickmaking, kilns, and in leatherwork. And one of the things she said is, our society is not a society until children are children, parents are parents, and teachers are teachers. Let us have a society where children can be children.
Well, I hope that's given you a bit of a taste of child labour in this international year that we are focusing on child labour. So, Nimity, over to you for any questions that people might have.
Thank you. That was very interesting, but very sobering listening, I have to say. I will open it up. If anyone I haven't seen any questions come through on the chat or the Q&A. Does anyone have any questions for Carolyn or Fuzz? I just have a question from my side. So in terms of both of your personal journey with this mission, what do you think is sort of the biggest thing that you sort of feel has been a positive impact since you've started your work?
Probably the Australian Modern Slavery Act would be one of the big ones. We looked at, and we were asking for a Modern Slavery Act since way back 2011. And we looked at what was happening in the UK and said, thank you very much, Mark 1, we can do better than that. And so for 2 years of our life, we lobbied, we worked with business, we worked with NGOs, we pulled them all together, and we looked at what we could do with our campaigning, and that's been a big part of who we have been with Big Slavery Free. And we saw that if there was a robust Modern Slavery Act it just raised the bar, and then we could move up from that. And it has done that. The conversations which are now being had in business, it's a supply chain act. It does not bring in all the things from the inquiry that looked at all the other aspects. It does not look at orphanage tourism, which is a form of slavery in the definition in Australia, in the Australian Criminal Code. It does not do enough on child marriage, which is one of the biggest areas of slavery in Australia. And but I think that's probably the big one. It sort of it whopped out 2 years of our life, but it was just an incredible investment because now we can work with businesses. The biggest power we have in Australia is what we buy. We're a consuming nation. Manufacturing has gone offshore. A lot of the agriculture has supplies have come from overseas now. We import, for instance, 72% of our seafood into Australia. But what we can say to companies and our theory of change is basically this. People, slave traders, let's call them what they are, buy and sell people to make money. If we can say to companies, check your supply chain, go down, become slave-free, have a clean one, what it does is that factories and farms and in boats are going to be told, look, we can't have slavery here because we're going to lose our markets. That becomes the big driver. And so it means that we can starve the slave traders. We love starving slave traders. It's the biggest thing that we can do.
Buzz, I think that answers, we've got a few questions coming through now. That probably answers the first one quite well, which was how much power do we have as consumers to make an impact on global supply chains? So it's really about what we buy and asking those questions of who we buy from.
That's a big one. We do the chocolate report every year, and we, again, have grown that by bringing partners together. We did an assessment on 32 chocolate companies and 20, how many retail chains that sell chocolate and confectionery?
20-something.
26, 28. It had a reach because of our partners, and the beauty of partnering is that you grow your capacity. You can inform consumers, you can help consumers make good choices, and with the reach, it went out just in print alone. It had a reach of 215 million this year because of the partners that we had. And so that helps consumers to say, what should I buy? I've got a choice. It is incredibly powerful.
Fantastic. So I've got a question here from Corinne. She asks, all the supermarkets in Australia say they are only selling slavery-free seafood from Thailand, Taiwan, etc. Can their assurances be trusted? Is someone or some system overseeing their claims, or should we only buy Australian or New Zealand fish and seafood?
That's a really interesting question, Corinne.
A good one.
A good one. And the answer I wish was yes or no, but it's not that simple. No supermarket in Australia claims they're only selling slavery-free seafood because nobody can claim that. What they do claim is that they've taken steps to trace their supply chain to ensure that the labour standards and conditions exclude the possibility of child labour and of other forced labour or bonded labour. They do have some kind of systems overseeing their claims. Those systems have primarily been adapted from environmental certification systems, and we would like to see them to be much stronger in the social areas. New Zealand was actually, seafood is very complex. So for example, currently a Chinese-owned fishing vessel flagged...
Or South Korean.
No, it was Chinese.
Oh, it's okay.
Flagged out of Fiji, so it was on a Fijian fishing license. Fishing in international waters has been found to have forced labour on it.
Mm-hmm.
Whose laws do they get prosecuted under?
It's complicated, yeah.
It's complicated. And in fact, New Zealand was doing exactly that because they'd sold off their fishing boundaries to South Korea and to China because they didn't have the capacity to fish them sufficiently. So there were vessels flagged from other countries fishing in New Zealand waters that were using forced labour. And New Zealand's done a good job of addressing that. What you can know in Australia is that fish must be labelled with its source, its country source. And if it isn't, you can ask that information and you can know which countries are most likely. We're trying to get, Senator Peter Whish-Wilson is hot to trot on this. He wants to get labelling of the food that's bought in restaurants, so that when you sit down for your seafood dinner, you also know whether the snapper that you are eating is from Australia or New Zealand or where.
Right. So we've got a follow-on question there from an anonymous. It says, I've heard people say that if we boycott specific brands and products that are produced with child labour, those children won't be able to work and their families will be worse off in the short term. Can you speak on this issue?
Yeah, most certainly. And a lot of people say, but, but at least if they're, if they're working, they bring something for the family. Slavery generally means they don't get any money. So it's one of the biggest misnomers around about slavery and child labour. Or at least, they're getting some money coming in. Most times they're not. There's not any money.
And they're not contributing to the family in helping out on the family farm because they've been trafficked somewhere else. So their families are actually much worse off short term and long term?
We worked, in the beginning, we worked on a name and shame. We'd find a company that had slavery in the supply chain, we'd go bad company, shame, 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 shame. We then realized if we're all just focusing on the bad and the shameful things, no one would understand what is happening. And so now we have a name and fame approach, which is when companies do change, when they start doing the right thing, we highlight this and we're trying to give them some fame for what they are doing. Now, that's an incentive. Now, companies, their currency is money. They are there. They're going to make profits. So how do we help them to make profits with a clean supply chain and to help the consumers to know who are the companies that are making the greatest efforts? We don't boycott anymore, but we do say, hey, find out what companies are doing and support the ones who are doing the most. In that way, we're going to certainly see a major turnaround and major changes starting to happen.
I like that, name and fame instead of name and shame. So we've got from Roger here, thank you for shining a light on child labour, Carolyn and Fuzz. Do you think that the term modern slavery detracts from the needed focus on child labour in countries where they are not familiar with the term, i.e., is it targeting consumers in the UK and Australia rather than the sources of child labour?
I think the thing is that the greatest effects on sourcing countries that are sourced from are the consumer countries, because most of them, it's not a domestic market. Most of them are selling if they're about to make any money, and they are large in the macro area that we were talking about, are the large companies. And I remember in Bangkok, went with Andy Hall and with 14 Myanmar people who have been caught in slavery in a poultry farm, and a couple of them were children. And the head of the Poultry Association, we had all the press where we had Reuters, we had international press, local TV stations, etc. And we handed over the 60, I think then it was 68,000 signatures. We printed them all off, and really big, thick. It's really nice when you print them off. It looks very impressive.
Sorry about the trees.
Yes. And then we handed this over, and he could not speak any English and nor understand. Everything had to be translated. Then he listened carefully and nodded occasionally. And so when the cameras are off, Andy and I took him aside, and I said to him, can I please explain why we're doing this? It's not that we don't like Thailand. We love Thailand. It's not that we don't want Thailand to develop. We do want Thailand to develop and to have foreign workers as well, because that's often the way that those countries the foreign workers come from actually survive, is the money being sent back. But do you realize that the markets that you're selling to actually are more and more demanding that there be clean supplier chains and there be no child labor, there be no slavery there. So what we're trying to do is to help you to maintain and to grow those markets with a clean supply chain so you actually can develop and grow. What's fascinating, all of a sudden he could understand English, and he went, oh, I not know that. I never thought of that. I think that's the power that we've got with this. And that's where we really, if we were to affect a lot of local areas, it is actually in Australia is buying from those areas. We've cut back on foreign aid, which is a disaster and immoral. After we promised that we would do, 7% and in foreign aid. A lot of the countries, the UK has cut back even more at the moment. It's not happening in this way. The other way that we can deal with this actually is through commerce and is through business. And the great effect that we can have is actually by helping the supply chains to actually do the risk assessment, do the auditing, follow it down through, which they have to do for the modern slavery statement if they are over 100 million turnover. And that's the big effect that we can have. And it's the greatest thing that we can do to really work on the macro and also on the meso, that's that middle level.
There's just one last question, Fuzz, which I think you've answered in part there, but to what do you attribute the increase in child slavery in the last few years? You touched on a decrease in foreign aid from some of the wealthier countries. Perhaps that's one of those impacts. And COVID you touched on as well.
I mean, probably the greatest contributor is poverty. And the countries where we're seeing child labour increasing are not doing well in their development areas. And some of that is because of COVID, although the research was actually done at the very, very beginning of COVID. So we still haven't seen the impact of that in the data. But some of it is also that the drive in countries like Australia to get things cheap. And, you know, one day we'll run a campaign that says cheap is not cheap. Cheap damages children. So it's the increase in poverty and the drive for cheapness. And perhaps I'll finish with this story. Fuzz and Artie were at a cocoa conference in the Dominican Republic. And it had just been announced that the price of cocoa was dropping yet again. So, you know, there are women there who are cocoa farmers, and Artie actually got up and said, we've got to stop thinking of people in developing countries and cocoa families as being bad parents.
Because there's child labour. Because
there's child labour. It's not actually their fault. And the heads of the women in the room just about nodded off, because they were being told that they were going to get even less for their products and that their children had to go to school. It was an impossible ask until the companies and the consumers were prepared to pay a price for the commodity that was fair.
I'll never forget this African mother got up, farmer, older lady, and says, and you want us not to have child labor, and you don't want to have us send our children out into working in the cocoa farms, and you're going to pay us what for our cocoa? And the whole room got it. Went electric. It's like, oh yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's been a really hugely informative presentation and discussion. Thank you. And we are out of time. I would just say to everybody listening that this is, you know, we will share the recording and we will share it to those that couldn't make it perhaps for the whole time as well. And if you want to do something and get involved, you can see there join the Be Slavery, go to the Be, I'm assuming that's Be Slavery Free website.
Yes, yeah. So embarrassing.
And you can sign up there to get updates, and you will get a lot of really good information. And of course, also when you buy Fair Trade, you're actually also ensuring that the products, as we talked about, don't include slavery in their supply chain. So, and more importantly, are free of child labour. So I wouldn't say more importantly, as importantly, free of child labour. So so doing those things really helps, and you can find us on all of the usual places: Facebook, Instagram, and of course the Fair Trade Association website. So we'll leave it there, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Timothy.
Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.